This part of the lecture, we are going to go over different MI principles. And there are 4 primary principles we are going to discuss. The first is expressing empathy. The second is developing discrepancy. The third is rolling with resistance. And the fourth is support self-efficacy. So the MI strategies, we're going to have a different part of our lecture, but it's important that the MI principles and MI strategies, it's important that you know that both of those things work together. They are separate, but they work together to have this overall experience of motivational interviewing. So let's go ahead and start with expressing empathy. So first, hopefully we all remember what empathy is and we understand how that is important for working with our clients. Empathy is essentially this ability for us to have kind of understanding and acceptance without having any sort of judgment or kind of criticizing for our client. And really what empathy can help us do is it helps us reflect an understanding of their current situation. And so that's helpful because most people, most of our clients, they just want to be understood, right? They just want to feel like someone understands where they're coming from and why they are behaving in the way that they are. So to express empathy, we must assume that the person's perspectives are understandable and comprehensible and, most importantly, valid. So we also need to seek and understand the person's feelings and perspectives on whatever health behavior change it is that we're looking at. So important that we know that we're looking at them from their perspectives, and we also want to, again, engage and understand their feelings without judgment. So empathy is distinct, right? So when we use the word empathy, we're really thinking empathy is different from the level of agreement, right, that we have with them. It's different from an overall feeling of warmth. It's different from this feeling of appraisal or approval. It's different from advocacy, it's different from reassurance or sympathy. Okay, so the 3 things that I think it most commonly gets, or the 2 things I think it most commonly gets confused with is pity and sympathy. And so I want to give you an example of how those 3 things are different, right? So pity is, I feel sorry for you. Most people don't want pity, right? Sympathy says, I feel your pain. Okay, and sometimes when people say that, when the client has that said to them from their coach or their trainer, a reaction that they might have is, well, you really don't feel my pain because you're not in my shoes. Empathy is, I respect your pain, right? It allows them to acknowledge that their pain is theirs, and at the same time, you're acknowledging it and recognizing that it exists. And that's important, and that's what empathy is. Okay, so why is empathy so important in motivational interviewing? Well, first, it communicates acceptance, right? And that acceptance is what's going to be able to help promote and facilitate change. It also encourages collaboration, right, between the coach and the client. And it leads to an understanding of the client's unique perspectives, feelings, and values, which essentially are what are needed to help facilitate change. Always remembering that the client is the expert in their own life. So here are some tips that I really encourage you all to use when you are having conversations with your clients, even in your own personal relationships with your loved ones, your family, your friends. These are some ways that can help you feel more connected and your people feel more connected to you. Okay, and this is how you can express empathy. So maintaining good eye contact. Nowadays, oftentimes we're distracted by things that are on our wrists, right? We're distracted by phones that are nearby. So maintaining that eye contact will help the person you're communicating with think and understand that you are with them, okay? Responsive facial expressions. So trying not to have a kind of a stone face, you're being responsive, reflecting that you're hearing them. Your body orientation. So how you sit in regards to the person that you're talking to, or how you're standing in regards to the person you're talking to, is going to kind of express how you feel. So if you have a client who is here and you're facing this way and writing down here, automatically, just because you're angled, that's going to tell the client that you're not as focused and intentional with them in that moment. So it's important to kind of show and square your body to them. Verbal and non-verbal encouragers. So I want you to kind of think through what that looks like. A lot of times my coaching, right, is done online. So I use a lot of these non-verbal encouragers so that they can kind of see that. So if I'm coaching a client online and they see me through the computer, I use a lot of my facial expressions, right? But I also use a lot of like thumbs up and like, I use my hands, I use my body language. So I use a lot of these nonverbal encouragers to kind of help them understand that I'm listening and I'm expressing empathy. Reflective listening, and we're going to spend a lot of time on that later, asking and clarifying questions, and then avoiding expressing doubt or passing judgment. That's probably the most critical component of expressing empathy. So another few reasons why empathy is important in MI is that it communicates acceptance and facilitates changes. Again, it encourages collaboration and it leads to their unique perspective. So making sure we understand those things is really important. All right, developing discrepancy. So this is important. So in the beginning, remember how we were talking about what discrepancy is. Essentially, discrepancy is this idea that there's a difference between where a client is and where they want to go, right? So the logic here is that motivation arises from discrepancy between the actual and desired states. So essentially what that says is if someone knows and acknowledges that this is where they are, but this is where they want to be, then discrepancy is what's in between there, okay? And we can help with motivation by creating and amplifying that discrepancy. So essentially what we're saying is we want to help our clients see that gap, see the contrast between where they are currently and where they want to be, or what they are currently doing and what they would want to do, okay? So our job is help to have our client develop and understand that discrepancy. So we could do this by exploring goals and values that align with their habits. So most of us will do some sort of goal setting with our clients, so that's incredibly important. But it's not only important to do short-term goals, but long-term goals, right? We need to establish what are their values, what are their dreams, right? What are things that they like to do, their preferred activities, who do they admire, what do they want to be? Okay, so with my clients, one of the things that I do to help develop a discrepancy is I do a well-vision assessment with them in the very beginning. And essentially what that tool is by the end of that well-vision assessment, I have a good idea, and so do they, of where they want to be in a year, in 3 years. Who are they? What does it feel like? What does it look like? And then during that assessment, we assess where they are currently, and then essentially I ask them to fill that gap. And that gap is this discrepancy that we're talking about. Here's a nice visual tool. So if some of your clients need that visual, this is a nice way of utilizing this. And I certainly have done this with a few of my clients in the past. And essentially what you have is advantages and disadvantages kind of on that left side. And on the top, right, your rows or your columns, you have staying the same and changing. And the goal is that as they fill this out based on that specific health-related behavior change, they're going to see a lot of advantages in changing. They're going to see a lot of disadvantages in staying the same, right? And that is the goal, and that is that discrepancy that we want to highlight. But again, important that it comes from them and not you. So resistance, right? So we talked about empathy, and discrepancy, let's talk about resistance. So resistance can be expressed as negating, it can be expressed as ignoring behavior, it can be expressed as arguing, and then also interrupting. So negating is going to be blaming or excusing, minimizing, unwillingness to change. You probably can kind of acknowledge that that's a very common thing that you might experience with a client. So clients will have a level of resistance that we're going to experience, right? Ignoring is going to be people, they don't want to answer a question, or they kind of revert that question and say something else, so they kind of just sidetrack altogether. Arguing is when clients will actually challenge you or maybe be hostile towards you, okay? And then interrupting you is when you are talking and your clients start to interrupt you as you're talking. Now, what's interesting about motivational interviewing is that since it is so client-focused, there's very little talking on the side of the coach, right? Most of the talking is the client, okay? So in order for this to happen, so for interrupting to happen as part of an example of resistance by a client, essentially that's really intentional because there's very little talking already happening by the coach. And so for interruption to happen, they're kind of being intentional to do that. So there are some counseling behaviors that can elicit resistance, right? So arguing for change. And again, this is something that we sometimes do on accident, right? So arguments strengthen beliefs and reduce likelihood of change, right? We need to be aware of that. Assuming the expert role, right? Claiming that preeminence, focusing on the client's perceptions of pros and cons and not yours. So that's a tool we can use. Another thing that we sometimes do that elicits or brings about this resistance is labeling. So if you identify a behavior and give them that label or that identification label, that might actually upset the person. So, and you might get resistance from that. So, for instance, if you're talking about someone who is not that active, but they see themselves as being relatively active, and you say, yeah, most of your behavior is pretty sedentary. Right away, because of labeling, right, you might put that person into a feeling of resistance, okay? If you're in a hurry, people might not feel as connected. They might not have this level of, whole person coaching that you want to have with motivational interviewing. And so you can get some resistance there. And then if you do have some sort of criticizing, shaming, or blaming, which shouldn't exist at all in any type of interaction you have with your client, then again, you're going to likely see some resistance. So resistance is a product of the interpersonal relationship. And there are things that we can do to diminish that resistance. Most importantly, resistance is a signal to respond differently, and it's valuable feedback. So likely when you utilize MI technique, there's going to be a moment where you feel a little resistance between your client and you. And when that happens, you need to kind of pause and you need to reflect and think, what can I do differently as a coach so that they aren't reacting in this kind of resistance way? Okay, so it's valuable feedback, and it's something that you need to take seriously and kind of change in how you are interacting with your client. So in its simplest form, the implicit theory of MI posits that MI will increase client change talk, which we'll talk about in a second. MI will diminish client resistance, we're hoping. The extent to which clients verbally defend the status quo, which is resistance, will be inversely related to their change behavior, okay, or behavior change. So essentially, the less amount of resistance they have, the greater the behavior change. And then the extent to which clients verbally argue for change, that change talk, will be directly related to behavior change. So the more change talk a client engages in, the greater that behavior change. And we're going to talk more about change talk and maybe even a little bit more of the resistance in later parts of this lecture, but mostly change talk and why that's important. Okay. So when you respond to resistance, what do you need to do? So if you are sitting there in a conversation with your client, what can you do to help respond to that resistance? First and foremost, you kind of just got to go with it. And it is what it is in the moment, so you have to roll with it. So behaviors that will reduce resistance, or some strategies that you can use, include reflections. So example of this is we'll talk about some different types of reflections. This can be simple, amplified, and then we'll talk about some other strategies, right? So reflections are one way that you can do it. Shifting focus. So changing, if you're realizing that they're getting kind of upset and resistance to this one topic, changing focuses into a different topic. Or the last thing, and I use this a lot with my clients, if I feel like something's kind of going wrong and I'm starting to feel a little bit of resistance, what I start to do is I start to emphasize their personal control. And so I'll say, you know what, I just want to thank you so much for being here. I think this is such a great conversation so far. And I'd love to just kind of remind you that, you know what, you're in power. You're in the power here, right? You have control, and you're the expert. So could you tell me a little bit more about this? When you do that, when you tell someone that they're in control and that they're the expert, immediately some of their guard kind of comes down. So that resistance that's there might actually go down. And then lastly is self-efficacy, right? And we know what self-efficacy is that situation-specific self-confidence. So that is important because we want someone's confidence in their ability to perform a specific behavior to be high, okay? And we also know that this self-efficacy is a key to motivation for change. So we know that self-efficacy needs to be there for long-term behavior change, okay? And it's a predictor of behavior change. We've seen that in study after study after study. So in order to support self-efficacy, people cannot be ready to change until they perceive both as what they want and what they're able to do as the same. Okay, so that needs to exist. The client, not the CPT or coach, is responsible for choosing and carrying out the change. So choosing and carrying out the change. What normally happens is that the CPT or the coach chooses the change and the client carries it out. What's different in MI is that is that the CPT is not responsible for choosing or carrying out the change. Our own beliefs in the person's ability to change becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So essentially what this says is if we as a coach don't believe in our own client's ability to make change, then likely it won't happen. So it needs to earnestly and genuinely come from you. And we can support self-efficacy in the spirit of MI by doing that, okay? So a quick learning recap, I want you to be able to list and describe the 4 different MI principles that we discussed. So that includes expressing empathy, developing that discrepancy, rolling with resistance, and then supporting self-efficacy. You should be able to describe all 4 of those and understand what they mean in regards to coaching and working with clients. Our next lecture is going to be on MI strategies.